May 8, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea. This was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never saw each other. It was fought entirely by aircraft. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was a day of triumph. They had located the American carrier force. Their valve dive bombers had rolled in on the USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown. They hit the Lexington hard. It was burning furiously, racked by internal explosions. It would soon sink. Then they turned on the Yorktown. A 550-pound armor-piercing bomb smashed through the flight deck of the Yorktown. It penetrated 3 decks before exploding deep inside the ship's bowels. The explosion was massive. It destroyed the aviation stores, started fierce fires, and twisted the ship's radar mast. Near misses from other bombs buckled the hull plates. The ship began to leak oil. The Japanese pilots, circling overhead, saw the smoke. They saw the ship maneuvering erratically. They flew back to their carriers, the Shokaku and Zuikaku, and filed their reports. 2 American carriers sunk, they claimed. Or at the very least, 1 sunk and 1 heavily damaged, out of the war for months. The Japanese admirals in Tokyo celebrated. They believed they had broken the back of the US Pacific Fleet. They knew the Americans had only a handful of carriers. With the Lexington gone and the Yorktown, in their minds, destroyed, the path to their next objective was clear. Their next objective was Midway Atoll. They planned the Midway operation based on a simple mathematical calculation. They would bring for heavy carriers. The Americans, they believed, could scrape together maybe 2, the Enterprise and the Hornet. It would be 4 against 2. A guaranteed victory. They didn't count the Yorktown. Why would they? They had seen it burning. They knew that repairing a bomb hit that deep required months in a specialized shipyard on the US West Coast. The Japanese officers mocked the American damage control abilities. They believed Americans were soft, unwilling to fight fires, quick to abandon ship. They were confident that the Yorktown was rusting on the bottom of the Coral Sea, or limping back to California, a useless wreck. They were wrong. The Yorktown was hurt, but she was still steaming. And she was heading for Pearl Harbor, not California. The USS Yorktown was a mess. As she limped away from the Coral Sea, her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, surveyed the damage. It was catastrophic. The 550-pound bomb had exploded in the ship's ventilation system. It had blackened the interior compartments. The watertight doors were warped. The fire mains were ruptured. The ship's near misses had sprung the hull plates. She was trailing a slick of oil 10 miles long. The explosion had destroyed the superheaters in the boilers, reducing the ship's top speed. The radar was malfunctioning. The elevators were jammed. By any standard peacetime metric, the ship was a total loss. It needed a complete overhaul. Normally, a ship in this condition would be sent to the Bremerton Navy Yard in Washington State. The repairs would take at least 3 to 6 months. The crew was exhausted. They had been at battle stations for days. They were sleeping on steel decks covered in soot. But they kept working. While the ship was sailing back to Pearl Harbor, the damage control parties were already fixing what they could. They shored up the bulkheads with timber. They pumped out the flooded compartments. They were motivated by a singular purpose. They knew the Lexington was gone. They knew they were the only thing standing between the Japanese and the West Coast. But as the Yorktown approached Pearl Harbor on May 27, she looked like a floating junkyard. Her paint was blistered. Her flight deck was patched with metal sheets. She sat low in the water. Japanese spies in Hawaii watched her arrival. They reported back to Tokyo, "The Yorktown has arrived. She is a wreck. She will be in dock for months." This confirmed the Japanese battle plan. They launched the Midway invasion fleet, secure in the knowledge that the crippled giant was out of the fight. They didn't know that Admiral Nimitz had already received the decrypted Japanese codes. He knew the Japanese were coming to Midway in a week. And he knew he needed 3 carriers to stop them. May 27, 1942. Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown slowly maneuvered into dry dock number 1. The caisson gate closed. The water was pumped out. The ship settled onto the blocks. Immediately, a team of naval architects and engineers swarmed the hull. They inspected the bomb damage. They checked the hull plates. They wrote up their report and presented it to Admiral Chester Nimitz. "Admiral," the chief engineer said, "to repair this ship properly, we need 90 days. 90 days. That would put the Yorktown back in action in August. The Battle of Midway was going to happen in 3 days." Nimitz looked at the engineers. He looked at the ship. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask for a compromise. He issued an order that is now legendary in naval history. "We must have this ship back in 3 days," Nimitz said. "She must sail to Midway." The engineers were stunned. 3 days? That's impossible. We can't even clear the debris in 3 days. Nimitz was firm. "I don't need her perfect. I need her floating. I need her flight deck flat. And I need her guns firing. Fix the rest later." He declared a state of emergency in the shipyard. He ordered that the Yorktown be given priority over everything else. He suspended all safety regulations. He authorized unlimited overtime. He told the yard commander to put every welder, every fitter, every carpenter in Hawaii on that ship. If it doesn't move, paint it. If it moves, salute it. If it's broken, weld it. The engineers looked at the calendar. It was May 27th. The Japanese were expected at Midway on June 4th. The ship had to sail by May 30th to get into position. It was a timeline that defied the laws of engineering. But the engineers didn't argue. They went to work. They realized that this wasn't a repair job, it was a resurrection. What followed was the greatest feat of industrial repair in history. 1,400 dockyard workers swarmed onto the Yorktown. They didn't work in shifts. They worked until they dropped, and then someone else picked up their torch. The dry dock became a city of sparks. At night, the ship was lit up by floodlights. The blue arc of welding torches flickered from every hatch and porthole. The heat was intense. Inside the ship, in the unventilated steel compartments, temperatures reached 120 degrees. Men passed out from the heat and the fumes. They were dragged out, revived with water, and sent back in. They cut away the twisted steel of the bomb hull. They didn't have time to fabricate new curved steel plates for the hull. So they took flat steel plates and welded them directly over the holes. It was ugly. It wasn't hydrodynamic. But it was watertight. The internal bulkheads that had been blown out were replaced. Not with steel, that took too long to cut. They replaced them with heavy timber beams. They literally patched the ship with wood and nails, shoring up the steel decks. The flight deck was the priority. They cut out the damaged section and welded in a new steel plate. They covered it with fresh wood planking. Within 24 hours, the flight deck was operational. The engines were a bigger problem. The superheaters were wrecked. The engineers bypassed them. They rerouted the steam lines. The ship wouldn't be as fast as she was new, but she could make 27 knots, enough to launch planes. The workers consumed mountains of food and coffee brought to them on the ship. They didn't leave for breaks. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, burning metal, and sweat. It was a frenzy of American industrial will. The Japanese officers who had mocked the American work ethic had no concept of this. They operated in a rigid system where repairs followed a strict protocol. The Americans threw the protocol into the harbor. They were improvising on a massive scale. On the morning of May 29th, just 48 hours after entering the dry dock, the water began to flood back into the basin. The Yorktown floated. She wasn't pretty. She was full of wooden beams and patch jobs. She still smelled of smoke. But she was a fighting ship again. As she prepared to sail, the workers were still on board, hammering the final nails, welding the final brackets. The crippled giant was ready to fight. And the Japanese had no idea she was coming. The repairs on the USS Yorktown were not just fast, they were improvised. In a peacetime navy, repairs are made with steel, rivets, and meticulous welding. They are inspected by naval architects. They are certified. On the Yorktown in May 1942, the repairs were made with whatever was lying around the shipyard. The most shocking element was the wood. The internal bomb damage had destroyed several steel bulkheads, the walls that keep the ship rigid and prevent fires from spreading. There was no time to cut and shape new steel plates. So, the shipyard workers brought in massive timber beams, huge square logs usually used for shoring up buildings or dry docks. They wedged these timbers into the twisted metal of the ship's frame. They bolted them together. They essentially rebuilt the internal skeleton of a modern aircraft carrier using the same technology as a 19th-century sailing ship. It was a plywood patch. The flight deck, too, was a quilt. The bomb hole was covered with a thin steel plate, welded flat. But to make it flush for the aircraft wheels, the workers laid down fresh pine planking. It smelled of sawdust and resin, mixing with the smell of bunker oil. The watertight doors that were warped were hammered shut and sealed. If they couldn't be fixed, they were welded shut permanently. This meant that if the ship flooded again, those compartments would be sealed tombs. But it ensured the ship wouldn't sink immediately. The engineering was ugly. It was rough. A Japanese naval inspector would have been appalled. He would have declared the ship unseaworthy. But the American engineers weren't building a ship to last 20 years. They were building a ship to last 1 week. They knew that the plywood patch only had to hold together long enough to launch and recover aircraft for one decisive battle. They were gambling with the structural integrity of a 20,000-ton vessel. But it was a calculated risk. A wooden prop holding up a steel deck is better than no deck at all. On the morning of May 30, 1942, the USS Yorktown sounded her siren. The water rose in the dry dock. The caisson gate opened. She floated. As the tugboats pulled the massive carrier into the channel of Pearl Harbor, a strange scene played out on her decks. The repairs weren't finished. Dozens of civilian yard workers, welders, electricians, pipefitters, were still on board. They were frantically finishing the last critical jobs, connecting the aviation fuel lines, fixing the elevators, welding the last patches on the hull. As the ship gathered speed and headed toward the harbor mouth, the abandoned ship order was given for the civilians. The workers gathered their tools. They scrambled down nets into waiting tugboats and small craft alongside the moving carrier. It was a chaotic departure. Some workers didn't make it off in time. They stayed on board as the Yorktown passed the submarine nets. They became involuntary crew members for the Battle of Midway, volunteering to help the damage control parties. The Yorktown also had to load a new air wing. Her original squadrons had been decimated at Coral Sea. She took on the orphaned squadrons from the USS Saratoga, which was undergoing repairs on the west coast. The flight deck was a beehive of activity. Planes landing, refueling, and being spotted. The crew was exhausted, but the sight of their ship moving under her own power, heading back to the fight just 3 days after arriving as a wreck, was a massive morale booster. They called her the Galloping Ghost. She was supposed to be dead. But here she was, steaming at 27 knots, hunting for the enemy that thought they had killed her. Dawn, June 4, 1942. Northeast of Midway. The Japanese carrier force, the Kido Butai, had launched their attack on the island. Admiral Nagumo felt secure. His reconnaissance reports told him there were no American carriers in the area. Then, the reports started to change. Enemy surface fleet sighted. Nagumo was worried, but he assumed it was cruisers and destroyers. Then, a scout plane reported, one carrier. Nagumo was shocked. One carrier? Where did it come from? He assumed it was the Enterprise or the Hornet. He knew the Americans had 2 left. He didn't know that there were actually 3 carriers waiting for him. The Yorktown was hiding just over the horizon. The Yorktown's air group, led by the veterans of the Coral Sea, launched their attack. They arrived over the Japanese fleet just as the Akagi, Kaga, and Sarayu were being hit by the Enterprise and Hornet bombers. The Yorktown's dive bombers, VS-3, targeted the carrier Sarayu. They planted 3 1,000-pound bombs directly into her hangar deck. The Sarayu exploded. In the span of a few minutes, the Japanese lost 3 carriers. Only one was left, the Hiryu. The Japanese commanders on the Hiryu were desperate. They launched a counterstrike of dive bombers. Their pilots followed the American planes back toward the U.S. fleet. They looked down and saw an American carrier. They identified it as a Yorktown-class carrier. "We have found the enemy," they radioed. They attacked with a fury born of vengeance. 7 Japanese valve dive bombers broke through the American fighter screen. They scored 3 hits on the Yorktown. 1 bomb blew a hole in the flight deck. Another exploded in the smokestack, extinguishing the boiler fires. The Yorktown slowed. Then she stopped. Black smoke poured from her stack. She went dead in the water. The Japanese pilot circled overhead. They saw the burning, motionless ship. They radioed back to the Hiryu, enemy carrier sinking. They believed they had destroyed the only American carrier in the fight. They celebrated. They thought they had evened the score. They didn't realize that this ship had a habit of coming back from the dead. 12:20 p.m. The Yorktown was adrift. The engine room was full of smoke. The boilers were out. The radar was dead. On a normal ship, this would be the end. The captain would order abandon ship. But the crew of the Yorktown had been here before. They had saved her at Coral Sea. They had fixed her at Pearl Harbor. They weren't going to let her die now. The damage control parties, trained in the brutal school of experience, went to work. They didn't panic. They grabbed hoses and wrenches. They isolated the ruptured fuel lines. They smothered the fires on the flight deck. But the most critical work was deep below, in the fire rooms. Sailors wearing breathing apparatus fought their way through the choking smoke to the boilers. The fires had gone out because the draft fan stopped. The intake valves were jammed. The engineers manually opened the valves. They relit the burners with torches. It was hot, dangerous work. If the boilers exploded, they would all die. But slowly, the pressure gauges began to climb. Steam pressure rising. At 1:40 p.m., just over an hour after being bombed and left for dead, the Yorktown's propellers began to turn. The yellow breakdown flag was lowered. A new flag was run up, My Speed 5. Then My Speed 10. Then My Speed 20. The fires were out. The flight deck was patched again. The ship was maneuvering. She was ready to launch planes. This was the miracle of American damage control. The Japanese doctrine was to fight until the ship was hit, and then die with honor. The American doctrine was to fight the ship while it was being hit, fix it, and keep fighting. When the second wave of Japanese planes, torpedo bombers from the Hiryu, arrived an hour later, the pilots were confused. They looked down and saw a pristine American carrier. It was moving at 20 knots. It wasn't smoking. It was shooting back. This must be a second carrier, the Japanese leader concluded. The first one is already sinking. They didn't realize they were attacking the same ship. The Yorktown had resurrected herself so effectively that she fooled the enemy into wasting their second strike on a target they thought they had already destroyed. When the sirens wailed for the second attack at 2:30 p.m., the crew of the Yorktown didn't despair. They went back to their guns. The ship was moving. The radar was working. The fighters were launched. The Japanese torpedo bombers, flying low and fast, expected a sitting duck. Instead, they faced a fortress. The Yorktown's anti-aircraft fire was disciplined and ferocious. The sea around the ship boiled with shrapnel. But the Japanese pilots were veterans, the best in the world. Despite heavy losses, they pressed the attack. They dropped their torpedoes in a classic anvil attack, coming from two directions so the ship couldn't turn away from both. Captain Buckmaster maneuvered the massive carrier like a destroyer, dodging two torpedoes. But he couldn't dodge them all. Two torpedoes slammed into the port side. Wham wham! The ship shuddered violently. The fuel tanks ruptured. The power failed instantly. The rudder jammed. The Yorktown listed sharply to port, 23 degrees within minutes. The flight deck was tilted at a crazy angle. The ocean was lapping at the hangar deck. In the darkness of the lower decks, the damage control parties faced their final test. The water was rushing in. The lights were out. They used handheld battle lanterns. They counter-flooded the starboard tanks to correct the list. They dragged wounded shipmates up vertical ladders in pitch blackness, fighting against the tilt of the ship. They didn't panic. They followed their training. Even as the order "abandon ship" was given, fearing the ship would capsize like the Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor, the evacuation was orderly. Men left their shoes in neat rows on the deck. They helped each other into the water. They had performed a miracle. They had kept the ship fighting long enough to absorb the entire Japanese counterstrike, sparing the other American carriers. The tragedy of the Yorktown created a strategic illusion that won the battle. When the Japanese pilots from the second wave returned to the Hiryu, they reported sinking a second American carrier. They were convinced. The first carrier they attacked, the Yorktown, was left burning and dead in the water. The second carrier they attacked, also the Yorktown, repaired, was moving and fighting. To the Japanese mind, it was impossible that a ship could be resurrected so quickly. Therefore, they concluded, there must be two carriers. Two carriers sunk, the radio reports shouted. Admiral Yamaguchi on the Hiryu did the math. If the Americans had 3 carriers, and we sank 2, there is only one left. He felt confident. He had 1 carrier left, Hiryu, against 1 American carrier. A fair fight. He prepared his planes for a twilight strike to finish the job. But his math was wrong. Because the Japanese had attacked the Yorktown twice, the Enterprise and the Hornet were untouched. They were fully operational. They were launching their own strike. While the Japanese were rearming, the American dive bombers from the Enterprise, including many homeless Yorktown planes, found the Hiryu. They dove out of the setting sun. 4 bombs tore the Hiryu apart. The illusion was shattered. The Japanese hadn't faced a diminishing enemy, they had faced a shell game played with a 20,000-ton warship. The resilience of the Yorktown had acted as a magnet, drawing all the enemy fire while her sisters delivered the knockout blow. The Yorktown refused to die. The morning after the battle, she was still floating. The list had stabilized. A salvage party, led by Captain Buckmaster, returned to the ship. They cut away the heavy anti-aircraft guns to reduce weight. They prepared to tow her home. It looked like she might make it to Pearl Harbor again. But a Japanese submarine, I-168, had slipped through the defensive screen. It fired 4 torpedoes. One broke the back of an American destroyer, the USS Hamman, which was tied alongside providing power. 2 more hit the Yorktown. Even then, she didn't sink immediately. She groaned. She settled lower. but she floated for another 18 hours. Compare this to the Japanese carriers. The Akagi, Kaga, and Sarayu were hit by bombs, not torpedoes, and turned into uncontrollable infernos within minutes. Why the difference? Doctrine. The Japanese fueled their planes in the enclosed hangars. The fumes had nowhere to go. They lacked advanced fire suppression systems. Their damage control training was rudimentary. When a Japanese ship was hit, the crew often focused on saving the emperor's portrait rather than the ship. The Americans fueled their planes on the open flight deck. They had purge systems to vent fumes with CO2. And crucially, every American sailor, from the cook to the pilot, was trained as a firefighter. The Yorktown survived 3 massive attacks, bombs, torpedoes, submarine, over 3 days because her crew fought the ship as hard as they fought the enemy. The Japanese ships died because they were built to dish out punishment, not take it. At dawn on June 7, 1942, the USS Yorktown finally gave up the ghost. She rolled over gracefully to port and slipped beneath the waves of the Pacific, her battle flag still flying. There were no men on board. They had all been saved. She lies there today, 3 miles down, sitting upright on the bottom of the ocean. Her loss was painful, but her legacy was total victory. Because of the Yorktown, the Japanese lost for carriers at Midway. They lost their best pilots. They lost the initiative. They never won another offensive battle. The Yorktown proved that the most important factor in war isn't just the strength of the weapon, but the resilience of the system behind it. It was the shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor who worked until they passed out. It was the engineers who patched the hull with timber. It was the sailors who went into the burning engine rooms. They turned a defeat into a stalemate at Coral Sea, and a stalemate into a victory at Midway. Japanese officers later admitted that the ghost ship unnerved them. It seemed like the Americans had an endless supply of carriers. They didn't know it was just the same ship, refusing to quit. The Yorktown, CV-5, had a short life, less than 5 years, but in those final 48 hours, she changed the course of history. She was the ship that wouldn't stay sunk until the job was done.